From the moment I laid eyes on the property, I knew it was a place where my dreams could finally breathe. Nestled at the edge of town, far enough to escape the constant hum of city life, but close enough to be part of a community, the ranch had everything I had ever wanted: wide open fields, sturdy wooden fences, and a horizon that stretched on forever. The air smelled of fresh grass and earth, carrying a crispness that city streets could never offer. Every morning, sunlight spilled across the land in golden sheets, and I could hear the distant lowing of cattle, the soft neighing of horses, and the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. It was a peaceful life waiting to unfold. I had worked years for this slice of freedom. Nights spent researching properties, weekends spent touring different plots, and countless hours calculating mortgages and expenses had finally culminated. In this moment, standing at the edge of my new driveway, keys in hand, I felt the rare mix of accomplishment and excitement. This ranch was mine, completely and entirely, a blank canvas where I could shape life on my own terms. Every tree, every fence post, every stone in the yard held potential for a story that only I would write. The first week was surreal. I drove slowly through the fields, letting the tires crunch softly over gravel paths, each turn revealing more of the property's hidden charm. There were small hills with perfect slopes for horseback riding, a creek that glimmered under the afternoon sun, and a barn that smelled of aged wood and history. I walked through every corner, inspecting every detail, imagining what could be done, where a garden might bloom, where animals could roam freely, and where I might one day host friends and family for weekend gatherings. Everything was exactly as I had envisioned. Neighbors existed on this quiet stretch of land, but they were distant enough to preserve my solitude. A few homes punctuated the long stretch of road, mostly ranches like mine. They were kind, reserved people, waving occasionally from afar, keeping to themselves. Their presence added a sense of security without intruding on the peace I had so long desired. It was, in every sense, idyllic until the day I first noticed her. Karen. The name alone would later be synonymous in my mind with conflict, bureaucracy, and harassment. At first, she appeared to be a regular neighbor, walking her small, perfectly groomed dog along the edge of her immaculate lawn. She wore the kind of confident expression that suggested nothing went unnoticed in her domain. There was a sharpness in the way she observed the world, a vigilant gaze that seemed to measure and judge the small details of everyone else's life. At first, I thought little of it. Perhaps she was simply a meticulous homeowner, the kind who ensured her property and surroundings reflected perfection. Little did I know, her meticulousness had an extreme side. Life on the ranch was a series of routines that brought immense satisfaction. Early mornings were spent walking the property, checking fences, and feeding the animals. Afternoons were for maintaining the land, trimming hedges, repairing barns, and planting crops. Evenings were quiet, lit by golden sunsets and the soft glow of lanterns on the porch. My only concern was making sure everything was running smoothly, and for a time, that was enough. There was a deep sense of pride in creating and maintaining a space that reflected effort, patience, and passion. Yet, as the first week passed, subtle signs hinted that harmony was fragile. It started with small, almost imperceptible observations. Karen's eyes followed me when I drove up my driveway. Her dog, always perfectly groomed, barked excessively whenever I passed by. Occasionally, she would pause her walk to watch my every movement, as though assessing my right to occupy my own land. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, this was my property, my life. No one had the authority to dictate how I enjoyed it, at least. That's what I believed at the time. The tension escalated subtly over the next few weeks. I began noticing notes left in my mailbox or tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. They were polite on the surface, referencing neighborhood guidelines and HOA regulations. Yet, beneath the politeness was an unmistakable undertone of judgment. It seemed harmless at first, a reminder here, a suggestion there, but each note carried with it an implicit threat, a warning that someone was monitoring me closely. I never responded, never acknowledged them directly, hoping that ignorance would diffuse the situation. Unfortunately, it was only the beginning. The defining moment came one crisp morning when I parked my truck at the edge of my property, near the barn. I had been running errands, returning home to unload supplies, and intended only to stay for a few minutes. It was a small act, completely reasonable, completely within my rights. Yet, before I could step out, I noticed Karen standing at the edge of her lawn, phone in hand. Her gaze was sharp, her posture rigid, as though she had already decided that my actions were unacceptable. The air felt heavier somehow. The quiet morning suddenly charged with anticipation I didn't understand. Moments later, I learned the true extent of her vigilance. The unmistakable wail of sirens broke the morning calm, and a patrol car slowly rolled down the gravel road. My stomach sank. The police weren't here for a routine check or a friendly wave, they were here because someone had reported me. For what? Parking at my own ranch. The absurdity was staggering, but so was the reality. Karen had escalated the situation, bypassing casual warnings, bypassing conversation, and going straight to authorities. My private sanctuary, the place I had fought for and dreamed about, had suddenly become a stage for confrontation I hadn't asked for. I stepped out slowly, hands raised, trying to convey calm and cooperation. The officer approached cautiously, clipboard in hand, scanning the area as though it belonged to someone else entirely. I explained, patiently, that this was my property, my driveway, my truck. The officer nodded politely, but the sense of tension lingered, thick and suffocating. In that moment, I realized that owning land didn't automatically protect me from intrusion, not from physical presence, not from bureaucracy, and certainly not from individuals willing to weaponize rules for personal satisfaction. As the officer drove away, I returned to the barn, heart still racing, mind spinning with disbelief. I had bought a dream, a peaceful haven, and within the first month, someone had turned it into a battlefield. Karen's presence loomed larger than her physical proximity. She represented an ideology I had not anticipated, a neighbor who believed her perception of propriety overrode the rights of others. A figure who could, with a simple call, bring law enforcement onto someone else's land. My sanctuary felt violated, my freedom questioned, and yet, in the quiet of the afternoon, standing among the familiar smells of hay and earth, I resolved that I would not be intimidated. The ranch was mine. The land, the animals, the barns, they all belonged to me. If someone wished to challenge that, they would have to go through more than just a phone call. I didn't yet know the full extent of what Karen was capable of, or how far she would go to enforce her vision of order, but one thing was certain. My life here, my dream ranch, had just entered a conflict I could not ignore. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the fields. I walked along the fence line, feeling the rough wood under my fingertips, grounding myself in the tangible, the real. Dreams could be challenged, sanctuaries invaded, and petty rivalries ignited, but the land remained steadfast. I would face this challenge, not with anger, but with persistence. I didn't yet know the battles ahead, the forms they would take, or the absurdity that awaited. But I knew one thing. I would not back down. Not here, not ever. As night fell, the ranch settled into a deceptive calm. Crickets chirped, the wind whispered through the trees, and stars dotted the sky in endless patterns. Yet beneath the serenity, attention, lingered a subtle promise of the storms to come. This was only the beginning, the opening chapter of a drama that would test my patience, my resolve, and the very rights I had fought so hard to claim. Karen had arrived in my life, and with her, the rules of the quiet neighborhood had shifted forever. The morning after the police incident, the ranch felt different. The sunlight still spilled across the fields in golden streaks. The creek sparkled under the early rays, and the barn smelled faintly of hay and earth, but the air carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. Karen's presence was no longer a distant concern. It had become immediate, palpable, almost suffocating. Each creak of the fence, each distant bark of her dog, felt like a reminder that someone was watching, waiting, and ready to challenge my claim to the very land I had fought so hard to own. I tried to ignore it, of course. Ignoring often felt like the easiest path. Let time erode tension. Hope reason would prevail. Trust that logic and ownership would protect me. I went about my usual routines, inspecting fences, checking water troughs, and ensuring that the barn doors closed tightly. Yet, every task was tinged with the awareness that my every move was potentially being scrutinized. Each creak of the truck's tires on the gravel felt louder than usual, echoing through the early morning air as though calling attention to my presence. The first face-to-face encounter came sooner than expected. I was walking toward the barn, with a stack of feed, the morning sun at my back, when Karen appeared at the edge of the property line. She didn't wave this time. There was no casual smile, no polite nod. She stood rigid, phone tucked tightly against her side, eyes narrowed. Her posture conveyed a single unwavering message. She was prepared to challenge me at every turn. I had hoped that the police visit would have been enough, that her actions would have paused once the authorities had witnessed the situation. But clearly, that was wishful thinking. Karen approached slowly, deliberately, maintaining a careful distance, yet clearly attempting to assert dominance over the space. She did not speak, but her gaze was sharp, calculating, as though she were cataloging every detail for later reference. In that silent confrontation, I felt the intensity of her scrutiny like a physical force pressing against my chest. The ranch, which had felt safe and secure only days earlier, now seemed like a stage for a performance I had not agreed to participate in. The absurdity of it struck me, but so did the seriousness. Karen was relentless, and her determination was obvious. Over the next few days, the subtle attacks began. Notes reappeared, this time more frequent and more specific, addressing the exact location of my truck, the angle at which I parked, and even the type of tires I used. The language was carefully chosen, polite in tone but aggressive in implication. The message was clear. She intended to monitor, correct, and escalate at her discretion. Each note felt like a direct challenge, undermining my sense of authority over my own property. It was a strange and unsettling experience being told, indirectly, yet unmistakably, that my presence and my rights were under scrutiny by a neighbor who seemed to equate oversight with ownership. The intensity of Karen's actions did not stop. At Notes. One afternoon, I noticed freshly trimmed grass along the edge of her property line, encroaching slightly onto mine. It was precise, almost surgical, as though she had measured every inch. I realized she was extending her influence visually, creating the illusion that her authority extended beyond her property. Small things, seemingly insignificant, suddenly carried enormous weight. Every adjustment she made to the environment around me became a silent declaration of power, and I began to feel a creeping sense of unease in what had once been a sanctuary. Despite the mounting tension, I tried to remain calm. To maintain perspective, I reminded myself that ownership was backed by legal documents, that the land belonged to me, and that no amount of intimidation could change the facts. I focused on the tangible aspects of ranch life, repairing fences, maintaining animal shelters, and ensuring water sources were clean and functional. The work became my refuge, the one constant that reminded me of the life I had fought to build. Yet, even as I immersed myself in labor, I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed at all times, that Karen's watchful eyes had become a permanent presence. Then came the day of the first formal complaint to the HOA. I had hoped, naively, that this entity meant to maintain order and fairness would be impartial, objective, and reasonable. Instead, I found myself at the mercy of bureaucracy, a strange and frustrating system that often favored compliance over justice. Karen had submitted multiple complaints, carefully documenting every instance where she believed I had violated neighborhood guidelines. The claims were meticulous, citing obscure regulations, vague rules about parking, and subjective standards of appearance. Each line of the complaint was a calculated move, designed to challenge my authority, question my behavior, and put pressure on me to conform to her standards. Reading the complaint for the first time, I felt a mixture of disbelief and fury. It was not just the content that shocked me, but the audacity, the sheer meticulousness of it. Every argument she made was presented as objective fact, yet it was rooted in personal interpretation, personal bias, and an unyielding sense of entitlement. It became clear that Karen was not merely a concerned neighbor, she was a strategist, meticulously planning each move to maximize discomfort and assert dominance. The reality hit hard. My dream ranch had become a battlefield. With Karen wielding the rules as weapons, I attempted to respond calmly, submitting my own documentation to the HOA, proving ownership, legitimacy, and compliance with every standard. Yet, the process was slow, bureaucratic, and often opaque. There were meetings to attend, forms to fill out, and explanations to give. Each interaction felt like a negotiation for my basic rights, a test of endurance in a system that seemed more concerned with appearances than fairness. As the days stretched into weeks, the tension escalated. Karen continued her surveillance. Her notes became more pointed, and her presence more intrusive. Every day, she reminded me that living on my own property was no longer simple. It was a constant negotiation with a neighbor who seemed to believe that authority could be claimed without legitimacy. By the time the first month had passed, the ranch no longer felt entirely like my sanctuary. I had learned to navigate the land with caution, anticipating Karen's observation, adjusting my routines, and documenting every interaction. The serenity of wide-open fields was shadowed by the knowledge that my actions, however reasonable, could trigger escalation at any moment. It was a strange juxtaposition, the beauty and freedom of the land, Paired with the absurdity and intensity of neighborly conflict, I felt both resilient and vulnerable. Proud of the property I had earned, yet frustrated by the relentless interference I could neither ignore nor fully control. As the sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, I realized that this conflict was far from over. Karen had escalated from passive observation to active intervention, from notes to complaints, from polite warnings to bureaucratic maneuvering. The ranch, my dream, my sanctuary, had become a stage for confrontation that was only beginning. And as I walked along the fence line, feeling the familiar rough wood beneath my fingertips, I understood that this battle would not be resolved quickly, quietly, or easily. The weeks following the first confrontation brought a new layer of complexity to life on the ranch. Karen's relentless scrutiny had grown sharper, more invasive, and far more sophisticated than I had initially imagined. Every note left on my doorstep, every complaint filed with the HOA, every moment spent outside felt like an inspection I had not consented to. The tension became almost tangible, a thick cloud that hung over the property, influencing the simplest of tasks: feeding the animals, moving equipment, or even stepping into my own driveway. The HOA hearings marked the true beginning of the battle. I arrived at the meeting with careful preparation, armed with documents proving my property ownership, photographs of my vehicles parked legally on my land, and records of every interaction I had with Karen to date. I expected a fair evaluation, a reasonable discussion, a chance to finally present the facts. Instead, I was met with bureaucracy that seemed designed to test patience, obfuscate truth, and favor perception over reality. Karen presented her case with precision. Every claim she made was accompanied by evidence she had gathered herself: photographs of my truck, detailed notes on my parking habits, and even commentary on the condition of the driveway. What struck me most was her unwavering confidence, the way she framed her narrative with authority. Her presentation was methodical, polished, and clearly rehearsed. It was apparent that she had spent hours preparing for this moment, anticipating every possible defense I could offer and countering it preemptively. The weight of her preparation was a stark contrast to my own defensive documentation. And I realized the battle was not only about property rights, it was about perception, influence, and control. The hearing itself was a tense affair. The HOA board listened to Karen's claims with attentive seriousness, asking questions that seemed to assume her perspective as the default. My responses, while factual and supported by documentation, often felt like they were being filtered through a lens of skepticism. Every word, every gesture, every explanation was scrutinized, dissected, and weighed against Karen's carefully curated narrative. The process was exhausting, emotionally draining, and increasingly frustrating. I began to understand the true power of strategy, preparation, and persistence in a battle that was as much about social dynamics as it was about legal rights. Meanwhile, Karen's tactics expanded beyond official channels. She began patrolling the area more frequently, sometimes driving past the ranch multiple times a day, observing the property, the vehicles, and even the animals. Her presence, once subtle, had become impossible to ignore. Every step I took on my own land was shadowed by the knowledge that she could be watching, recording, or reporting. The mental strain was significant. What should have been peaceful, routine activities now carried a weight of vigilance and strategy. The ranch, which had once been a refuge, began to feel like a stage for ongoing surveillance. As the conflict intensified, I noticed subtle but deliberate changes to the property. Line markers, stakes that had once clearly delineated my land, were moved or altered, seemingly to create confusion about boundaries. It became apparent that Karen was attempting to assert visual dominance, to make it appear that her influence extended further than it legally could. These minor adjustments, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, were part of a calculated campaign to control perception. It was a strategy designed to make me doubt myself, question my rights, and spend energy defending space that was unquestionably mine. In response, I documented everything meticulously. Photographs, time-stamped videos, and detailed notes became essential tools in protecting the ranch and myself. Every interaction, every movement, every note left by Karen was carefully logged. I realized that living with Karen as a neighbor required a level of vigilance I had never anticipated. The fight was no longer simply about parking a truck. It had become a contest of preparation, documentation, and endurance. The ranch was a battlefield, and every day brought a new skirmish. The HOA hearings stretched over multiple sessions. Each time, Karen arrived fully prepared, presenting evidence, With unwavering confidence and precision, I countered with my own documentation. But the hearings revealed a fundamental truth. The board seemed more concerned with conflict resolution than with objective justice. Compromise, mediation, and perception often outweighed factual accuracy. It was a delicate balancing act, where both sides had to be heard, but Karen's strategy ensured she always had the upper hand. Outside the hearings, life on the ranch became increasingly constrained. The presence of Karen's patrols, her frequent notes, and her constant observation influenced behavior in subtle ways. I began planning tasks based on anticipated scrutiny, avoiding certain activities when I knew she was nearby, and adjusting routines to minimize confrontation. It was a psychological strain that grew with each passing day. A constant reminder that living on your own property could feel like walking a tightrope over invisible traps. Despite these challenges, moments of calm and clarity still existed. The ranch retained its beauty, the sunsets painting the fields with amber and rose, the wind rustling through the tall grass, and the animals moving peacefully across the land. These moments became vital for mental resilience. They reminded me of why I had pursued the ranch in the first place, a dream of independence, connection to nature, and freedom from interference. Yet, the contrast between serenity and scrutiny was stark, amplifying the stress and intensity of the conflict. As Chapter 3 drew to a close, it became evident that Karen's campaign was relentless. Her tactics were evolving, becoming more sophisticated, more invasive, and more difficult to counter. The HOA hearings had only partially resolved the official disputes, and the personal pressure continued unabated. I realized that this was not a temporary annoyance or a minor conflict. It was a long-term battle requiring patience, strategy, and unwavering focus. The ranch, my sanctuary, was now the stage for a complex, escalating confrontation with a neighbor who seemed determined to challenge my every move. The calm of the ranch had grown fragile, like a thin layer of ice over deep water. Karen's scrutiny had begun to take on a more audacious form, shifting from daytime patrols and HOA complaints to nighttime intrusions. What had started as park disputes now extended into actions that felt increasingly personal and intimidating. Every creak of the gate, every shadow cast by the moonlight, and every rustle in the tall grass could be Karen, observing, recording, or deliberately testing boundaries. The first sign of escalation came on a seemingly ordinary night. I had finished evening chores, closing gates, feeding livestock, and double-checking vehicles. The ranch, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, seemed peaceful. Then came the faint crunch of tires on gravel, a sound too precise and deliberate to be a coincidence. I peered through the window and saw her minivan parked near the edge of my property line. Headlights dimmed, engine running. It was clear, Karen had moved from passive observation to active intimidation. I documented the incident immediately. Every vehicle, every angle of approach, every time-stamped detail was logged. I began to notice a pattern. Karen was choosing specific nights, aligning them with my personal routines, attempting to provoke responses, or simply making her presence known in a way that was impossible to ignore. The psychological impact was immediate. Sleep became restless. Anxiety crept in, even during daylight hours, and the feeling of ownership over my own land began to feel threatened. The ranch, once my sanctuary, now carried an undertone of vigilance and unease. The intrusions were not limited to mere presence. Items in the driveway and around the property began to shift mysteriously. A stack of feed bags moved slightly overnight. Tools on the porch appeared to be repositioned. Subtle changes that might have seemed trivial at first now took on sinister significance. I realized that Karen was testing boundaries, gauging reactions, and asserting control in the only way she could, through disruption and intimidation. In response, I escalated my own documentation. Motion-sensitive cameras were installed at every corner, pointing at key access points and vehicles. Night vision cameras captured activity under moonlight, while strategically placed lights highlighted the perimeters. The ranch was slowly transforming into a monitored fortress, a countermeasure to Karen's escalating tactics. Every intrusion, every adjustment, every suspicious presence was captured in real time. What had been simple property maintenance became a meticulous routine of surveillance, record keeping, and strategy. Meanwhile, the HOA, despite repeated updates and complaints, continued to operate with cautious neutrality. They acknowledged Karen's complaints and my counter-evidence, but their official stance remained neutral, mediation and careful consideration rather than enforcement. This impartiality, while reasonable in theory, left a vacuum where Karen's audacious tactics could persist without immediate consequence. It became clear that relying solely on the HOA would not be enough. The battle had moved into a personal domain where preparation and documentation were paramount. The psychological impact of these midnight disturbances cannot be overstated. The uncertainty, the fear of confrontation, and the constant surveillance created a pervasive tension. It was as though the ranch itself had become a stage where Karen performed her power, attempting to elicit reactions, provoke mistakes, and assert dominance. I began to schedule tasks strategically, only stepping outside under conditions that minimized exposure. Yet, despite the precautions, the stress of constant vigilance weighed heavily, and each day felt like an exercise in endurance. Karen's tactics were evolving further. Flyers began appearing on nearby properties, warning neighbors of dangerous parking and irresponsible land use. She crafted a narrative designed to frame her actions as protective, her perspective as rational, and my presence as disruptive. The local community, previously neutral or uninvolved, now had pieces of her curated story, carefully designed to sway perception and isolate me. The psychological warfare extended beyond the physical boundaries of the ranch into the social sphere, affecting reputation, relationships, and influence. Despite the mounting pressure, I remained deliberate, methodical, and patient. Every encounter, every intrusion, and every complaint was carefully logged, creating a chronological record that began to tell a story far beyond individual disputes. Evidence of her nighttime surveillance, her deliberate disruptions, and her attempts to manipulate neighbors and the HOA formed a clear pattern of harassment. The careful compilation of this evidence became a shield, a tool to reclaim agency and assert boundaries against her relentless campaign. The emotional toll was undeniable. The ranch, once a place of freedom, became a landscape of calculated caution. Sleep was interrupted by shadows and unexpected sounds. Chores were executed with heightened awareness, weighing risk against necessity. The subtle beauty of the property sunsets over fields, the wind through trees, the animals moving peacefully was overshadowed by the knowledge that each moment could be observed, manipulated, or weaponized by Karen. Yet, these very challenges also strengthened resolve, turning frustration into determination, fear into meticulous preparation, and disruption into opportunity for gathering irrefutable evidence. S. Chapter 4 closed. The stage was set for the next escalation. Karen had moved from daytime observation to nighttime intrusions, expanding the battle into realms that tested boundaries, patience, and mental resilience. The ranch, the animals, the vehicles, and every inch of personal space were now caught in a silent war of surveillance, perception, and control. The next chapter would reveal the tipping point, the moment where evidence, persistence, and community awareness began to shift the balance, exposing Karen's obsession and setting the stage for confrontation that could no longer be ignored. The tension that had gripped the ranch for weeks began to crystallize into a clear pattern. Karen's actions were no longer random disruptions or petty complaints, they were a calculated campaign, escalating in both audacity and severity. Her presence, her surveillance, and her attempts to manipulate perception had reached a point where evidence could no longer be ignored, and the reality of her obsession began to emerge for anyone who chose to look closely. It started with a careful review of the footage captured by the cameras installed around the property. Night vision recordings revealed Karen's minivan creeping along the boundary lines, headlights dimmed, engine idling. Each intrusion was methodical. She moved slowly, her body language deliberate, as if aware of every angle and camera in place. There were moments where she crouched low, flashlight in hand, tossing small objects onto the property and retreating into the shadows. It was clear that she was testing responses, intentionally provoking concern without leaving obvious traces of her presence. The objects she left behind were minor at first, small sticks, displaced garden tools, but the pattern became undeniable. One night, a suspicious package appeared in the driveway, a bag containing meat treated with a chemical that could have been harmful to livestock or pets. The discovery was alarming, but the foresight of the surveillance system turned potential danger into a critical opportunity. Every motion, every movement, and every interaction was captured, providing a chronological record of events that revealed her intent without ambiguity. Meanwhile, Karen's campaign extended beyond the ranch. Flyers, social media posts, and whispered warnings about illegal parking and unsafe land practices reached neighbors, carefully constructed to create fear and manipulate perception. Each piece of propaganda painted me as irresponsible, reckless, or even dangerous, while simultaneously portraying her as a vigilant guardian of neighborhood standards. The social dimension of the conflict became as critical as the physical one. The battle for reputation and narrative control was intensifying. With a complete archive of evidence compiled, it became possible to see the full scale of her obsession. Security footage, photographs, timestamps, and documented HOA complaints created a clear timeline that exposed her escalating harassment. Every intrusion, every manipulated narrative, and every false claim became part of a comprehensive case that would prove invaluable if legal or law enforcement action became necessary. What had started as a personal nuisance now had the weight of undeniable proof. The turning point came when a particularly audacious act occurred. Karen arrived at the property during daylight hours, carrying her usual binder of complaints and a camera aimed directly at parked vehicles. She was attempting to fabricate a violation, documenting normal ranch activity as evidence of misconduct. But the prior installation of visible cameras, strategically placed inactive, meant that her actions were recorded from multiple angles. Every attempt at intimidation and fabrication was captured on film, exposing both her intent and the absurdity of her claims. Neighbors who had previously avoided involvement began to take notice. Conversations about strange behavior and unfounded complaints started circulating organically. People who had once been hesitant to speak were now providing testimony about their own encounters with Karen attempts to manipulate, spread fear, or assert authority where none existed. Her aura of control, once intimidating and unquestioned, began to crack under the weight of collective observation. The HOA, presented with documented evidence and multiple corroborating accounts from the neighborhood, faced undeniable facts. Karen's complaints were meticulously countered with timestamped security footage, photographic proof of normal activity, and testimony from multiple residents. The board could no longer rely on assumptions or her charisma. The objective evidence presented a narrative of harassment and obsession rather than legitimate concern. The shift in institutional response marked the beginning of Karen's unraveling. As the campaign against me began to collapse under scrutiny, Karen escalated further in desperation. Late-night trespassing became more frequent, the timing of disruptions more precise, and her social tactics more aggressive, but each act of escalation only added to the growing archive of evidence. The more she tried to manipulate reality, the clearer it became that she was creating a trail of undeniable misconduct. Her obsession, once hidden beneath a veneer of authority, was now completely exposed to anyone willing to look at the records objectively. The ranch itself, once a site of passive tension, had become a stage for her unraveling. Every gate, vehicle, and parcel of land she attempted to influence or intimidate became part of the evidence collection. Cameras captured shadows moving in the moonlight, objects misplaced deliberately, and interactions with neighbors intended to coerce or mislead. The pattern was overwhelming, a single story told through countless discrete actions, each reinforcing the narrative of harassment. By now, the psychological impact on Karen was apparent. Even without direct confrontation, her movements became more erratic, her presence more aggressive, yet her influence diminished. Neighbors no longer feared her claims, they questioned them. Conversations that once reflected deference or avoidance now included skepticism, fact, and even gentle admonitions. The tide of community perception had turned, and Karen's carefully constructed persona of authority began to erode under the weight of documentation, truth, and collective awareness. The chapter closed with the realization that the next phase of the conflict would be decisive. The accumulation of evidence, the shift in community sentiment, and the mounting pressure on the HOA and legal systems created a scenario in which Karen's actions could no longer be ignored or excused. The stage was set for a confrontation, where accountability, legality, and public scrutiny would converge, forcing a resolution to a campaign that had escalated far beyond simple neighborhood disagreements. The culmination of weeks of harassment, manipulation, and escalation reached its climax as official authorities finally intervened. With the wealth of evidence, amassed security footage, timestamps, photographs, and neighbor testimony, narrative that had once been dominated by Karen's obsessive claims now belonged to objective reality. The situation had evolved from a minor neighborhood dispute into a fully documented case of harassment, trespassing, and intimidation, with the potential for serious legal consequences. The day began quietly, yet with an underlying tension that could be felt across the ranch. Police vehicles arrived, their presence a stark contrast to the erratic, unchallenged power Karen had once wielded. Officers approached methodically, carrying reports and clear instructions, aware of the depth, of the evidence and the seriousness of the allegations. Every step was precise, professional, and measured a reflection of authority facing chaos. Yet armed with certainty, Karen, confronted with this official presence, exhibited the first cracks in her composure. Her posture, once upright and commanding, faltered under the weight of scrutiny. She attempted to assert control, lifting her chin and gesturing as though to explain herself. But the officer's focus remained on documented facts. Every attempt at narrative spinning was countered by footage, testimony, and records that left no room for misinterpretation. The officers conducted a thorough sweep of the property and reviewed materials relevant to the case. Security footage showing her nocturnal trespassing, her placement of suspicious objects, and her attempts to provoke disturbances became undeniable proof. Objects that had been left with intent to intimidate or fabricate incidents were catalogued, examined, and confirmed as deliberate acts. Karen's claims of concern for safety dissolved under the clarity of documented evidence. Neighbors, who had witnessed portions of the harassment or were aware of the rumors, gathered discreetly, witnessing the proceedings with a mix of relief and vindication. Many had been hesitant to intervene, fearing her reprisal or social influence within the HOA. Now they observed validation unfolding, a tangible acknowledgement of what they had known all along. The communal sense of justice began to replace the fear that had dominated interactions for months. The officers then delivered official documentation, formal notices of investigation, potential charges for trespassing, harassment, and attempted animal endangerment. The tone was firm yet procedural, emphasizing that the law required accountability regardless of social status, HOA position, or personal perception. Karen's previous belief in immunity derived from her HOA authority and her social intimidation tactics was shattered. The consequences were now unavoidable. Throughout the process, her reactions ranged from denial to panic. She attempted to assert innocence, claiming misinterpretations, mistakes, and yet each defense collided with tangible evidence, time-stamped videos, neighbor testimonies, and the documented trail of her escalating behavior. Her arguments were no longer persuasive. They were irrelevant in the face of organized, irrefutable facts. As the intervention concluded, Karen's authority within the neighborhood evaporated entirely. Her previous influence on HOA decisions, her social sway over neighbors, and her ability to manipulate perceptions were nullified. The community, once fractured and cautious, began to rally around clarity and truth. Residents who had been isolated by her aggressive behavior reasserted their autonomy, and the ranch, once a stage for tension and manipulation, returned to a state of normalcy. In the weeks that followed, legal processes formalized the consequences. Karen faced fines, formal warnings, and restrictions on her ability to file complaints without evidence. Legal action was taken regarding trespassing and the placement of harmful objects on the property. The cumulative effect of these measures was both punitive and preventative, ensuring that harassment could not continue unchecked. The law, previously bypassed or manipulated by her social influence, now acted decisively. The ranch itself returned to a state of peace. Vehicles could be parked freely, equipment used without fear of fabricated complaints, and livestock or pets maintained without interference. The presence of surveillance cameras, once a necessary precaution, became a symbol of protection rather than tension. Each recorded act of harassment remained archived, not as a source of anxiety but as a testament to resilience, preparation, and the power of documented truth. Neighbor relationships, strained under months of manipulation, began to heal. People who had been hesitant to speak now openly discussed their experiences, acknowledging the challenges they faced while affirming collective accountability. The social fabric, frayed by fear and coercion, was mending. Communities that had once deferred to Karen's imagined authority were now united by shared understanding and the restored integrity of their neighborhood. The final resolution was both public and symbolic. Karen, stripped of HOA influence and subject to legal oversight, became a cautionary figure, a representation of the consequences of obsession, manipulation, and disregard for law and community norms. The narrative she had tried to control was now documented, analyzed, and understood by all who had witnessed it. Her downfall was not sudden but inevitable, built upon the accumulation of evidence, the perseverance of the affected residents, and the application of law where social influence had failed. For the ranch owner, the experience was transformative. What began as a conflict over parking and perceived violations escalated into a profound lesson on preparation, documentation, and resilience in the face of harassment. The careful installation of security systems, meticulous record-keeping, and patience in the face of provocation had created a foundation that turned chaos into accountability. The eventual vindication was both personal and communal, reaffirming the principle that truth and evidence, when preserved and applied consistently, can overcome even the most persistent social manipulation. By the time calm returned, Karen's reign of intimidation was conclusively over. The neighborhood, once held in tension, breathed freely. The ranch, now a symbol of steadfastness and careful preparation, stood as a reminder that vigilance, documentation, and perseverance are powerful tools in protecting property, peace, and personal integrity. The lesson, observed by all, was clear: unchecked obsession, when confronted with organized truth and communal awareness, is destined to collapse.